Good afternoon, everybody. You are listening to Too Much CGI, the greatest show on the dial, guaranteed to make you smile. It's a warm 67 degrees here in Philadelphia, and you're listening to... Oh, I missed the post, Scott. I was so close. All I had to do is...
the post.
I just had to squeak out Olivia Newton-John, but I just missed it. That's why they never let me have a career in radio. I was always really bad at hitting the post. You know, I never know, like, how do they do that in the old radio days? They never fucked it up. They always were able to throw in a bazillion words and stop right before the lyrics started. And I just think that's, like, incredible because you try to do it. You want to do one?
No, it's impossible.
Let me hear you
I can't
do
that. It's an art form. No, I can't. All right. Give me a go. Give me a go.
Oh, okay, here we go.
Hey, good morning, everybody. You're listening to Bill and Scott here on Too Much CGI, the best podcast around for your 80s and pop culture trivia. You're now listening to Olivia Newton-John. Let's get physical.
Nope, you missed it.
I tread on it. Fuck.
Harder than you think.
It's an art form, man.
That's another thing you're not going to hear a ton of going forward. I mean, eventually you're not going to hear these radio DJs. They are a dying breed.
Yeah, man. It's all algorithms now. It's all streaming services. There's radio. Who needs a radio?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, one day we're just going to have internet in the car. And I mean, yeah, it's going to be like my car now. It doesn't even have a CD player. And to me, I was like, That's crazy. Like, they're dead. CDs are gone. One day you won't have an AM, FM. I mean, is there even AM anymore? Like, who's listening to AM radio today?
I am listening to AM radio when I'm driving and I listen to the Phillies games. AM sports talk radio is still a big thing.
Why wouldn't you listen to it on the internet? Isn't it being broadcast on the internet?
I've never really tried it. I just turn on. Well, actually, yeah, you can actually listen to 94.1 in Philly and get WIP. They cover the Phillies games too, but locally here in Reading, they have AM WEEU that plays all the Phillies games. So that's how I listen to it. It's just how I've always listened to it. There's a lot of marketing things with baseball and sports teams where, like, you have to subscribe to MLB's app to be able to stream the audio of the game and shit like that, where radio just gets it to you for free. But one thing of this dying breed of radio that is something that I'm really going to miss is the really hokey local commercials, because it's cheap advertising. The production quality of some of these commercials is fantastic.
Especially the car dealerships.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Act now, hurry, now. We have a great deal on a something fucking car. And if you could hear quickly. Like in Philly, it was really annoying.
Barbera's on the avenue.
Is Barbera the best? Boy, I guess. Oh, they were obnoxious and stupid, but that was how it was back in the day.
If our name's not on your car, you probably paid too much.
If you're not from Philly, like, I would love to hear you. If you guys could send us in what your local AM radio station commercial sounded like, I guarantee they sound the same.
Identical. Because the same production companies are doing it all.
Yeah. Well, we're talking about the old days because today's episode is actually we're talking about the 80s, Scott. We're talking about the 80s, just in general. And we have a guest on the show today.
Yeah.
A guy I really enjoy. He's a podcaster. He is the host of 80s Now. I know you love the show.
Yeah, 1980s Now. It's a good show. I listen to it every week.
Yeah.
Sometimes twice a week.
So on the show today, we have Will Padilla. Will Padilla hosts the 80s Now show. He's got a pretty good crew over there. He's always got some really interesting topics. The show is really good. It's a great show. The people he talks to, sometimes he's got celebrity interviews. I really enjoy those. It's a great show. If you haven't checked it out, definitely go and look it up. But he's going to join us today. We're going to talk just generally about some of the things that we loved about the 80s. And the idea for this show came from the last episode. We were talking about there was just like a nostalgia that's been hitting me lately for the 80s in particular. And there's a thing that's been in my head from South Park. There was a episode of South Park where Mr. Mackey, you know who I'm talking about?
I do.
That guy.
Drugs are bad.
Okay. Are you still watching South Park?
I haven't watched the newest season, but I've watched the last season. So yeah, I still watch it.
I'm not a heavy watcher of it, but it was just one of those times where I was flipping through the channels and I saw this episode. Mr. Mackey could not let go of the 80s. In this episode, he was just reliving the 80s, and he was just getting depressed about, life today because it's not as good as it was in the 80s. And as I'm watching this episode, I'm kind of embarrassed because I feel like Mr. Mackey. I legitimately look back at the 80s and just think that was the best time of my life. I'm a Mr. Mackey. And I think about all the things that I loved and I compare that decade to today. And of course it's different, but I just think everything was better back then. The end of the show, the end of the episode, they kind of say to Mr. Mackey, somebody comes up and says, Mr. Mackey, listen, it's not because the 80s were better. It's because you were young and you were growing up in that time. We had the same problems we have today back then. And I listened to that message in South Park and I went, fuck that. No, it was better back then. And I start, ever since that episode, I go through in my head all the time, like, oh yeah, it was a lot better back then because of this reason. And that's what I'd like to talk about a little today with you and Will when Will joins. I have a bunch of questions for you guys, and I'm just dying to get into this conversation.
All right.
But before we do that, I want to remind everybody that if you'd like to communicate with us, you can go to toomuchcgi.com. All of our stuff is there. You can subscribe through that website. You can email us through that website. You can go to Too Much CGI on Twitter. You can find us on Facebook. We're getting more active in the socials. The problem with our show, Scott, I've realized, our demographic, we're not that into social media, So it's like,
guilty as charged.
How the hell do you advertise? How the hell do you advertise this podcast when nobody really cares about social media in our demographic?
I think it all comes down to word of mouth. I mean, you talk to your buddies usually like the same shit you do. I think that's where most of our listeners are coming from.
Nothing wrong with that. We're a word of mouth show, I guess, until we hit it big.
I came to a realization this morning. Tomorrow, episode 26 is going to drop. For a weekly show, 26 episodes, that is a half a year's worth of work right there. A half a year's worth of entertainment.
Well, hip, hip, hooray.
I still feel like we're a brand new show.
Yeah, it does not feel long at all.
Not at all. Do you ever go back and listen to the first episodes when we were still trying to put the pieces together?
Yeah, the pilot's pretty funny. The pilot's the most listened to episode. And all I can think is people are going to the beginning and playing the pilot and hearing this and being like, Christ, I ain't listening to 25 more episodes of this bullshit. But it did get a lot better.
Yeah, we tightened up. Our whole MO is build this ship while sailing.
That's a great analogy. Fantastic.
So before Will joins us, we don't have any fuck-upperies. We don't have any mail. It's been kind of a slow week. Even the news is slow.
Yeah, we say we don't have any fuck-upperies, but I'm sure our buddy Jim out there is just waiting to fucking let us know that I said something wrong. Probably about South Park.
We could try a brand new segment, one we've never done before. It's brand new. Brand fucking new.
Still in the packaging. What do you got for me?
Is everyone so excited? Here it comes. You ready?
Yeah.
Drum roll. It's called What Are You Watching?
I feel like we talk about this every week. We just never gave it a name, so it's brand new. I love it.
Well, normally it's what are you into? But now I'm just curious about the shit you're watching. So I like it. We just make up segments. Brand new. Build the ship while sailing. We're just making up segments as we go. Yeah. So it's been a slow week, like I said, but I have been checking out some TV. I've got some downtime, so I watched some TV. I'm actually caught up on some things. So I got a couple things I'm watching. Have you caught the new Eric Andre show episodes?
I've seen clips of them. I have not watched full episodes, but yeah, he's a ball buster and very much a prankster.
You were telling me the other day how you never really got into the Jackass stuff. And Eric Andre is trying to pick up, the torch and carry it while the Jackass guys are too fucking old and broken now. They can't do a lot of this stuff. So, Eric Andre is like, I'm going to be the next Jackass guy. I'm going to put together a show. And he's on season 5, I think. And I love this fucking show. I mean, this guy is insane. And what he puts himself through is insane. And what he puts other people through is insane. And one of the greatest things about the show is people who are his guests, because he has a couple guests on every episode, they don't know the show. So they come right out as the curtain opens because it's a talk show format.
Right.
And they just like, it's the first time they've seen anything about the show. So when they walk out, like he's got it so set up to where it's the most bizarre thing they'll ever see. Right? Hannibal Buress, who's a fucking hysterical comedian. Sometimes he's there, sometimes he's not, and they replace him with like some fill-in guy who's like a naked guy. Like they just, how crazy can it be? So when the guests come out and they don't know what they're on, he goes hardcore on them.
It's definitely a combination of Jackass and Between Two Ferns with Zach Galifianakis, where it was like that talk show element where he just like completely asks 100% inappropriate questions and just completely catches the guest off guard. But then there is that Jackass prank element, physical stuff going on. Yeah, it goes back to that cringiness that like I got to turn this off. I can't watch this. That's usually me being made an ass out of.
There's one part where he's interviewing Stormy Daniels, and he announces her as, "Hey everybody, please welcome to the show, Stormy Daniels. She fucked the president." Like she walks out, she's like, yeah, oh, okay, and she's just looking around. And there's a band this season. It's like it's an Asian band. It's just like they look like a hair metal band, and all of a sudden the camera will go to them, and like they can't speak English, and they'll try to ask a question to the guest. It's just bizarre. The guest is like, this is really happening. I don't know how to react. So I would highly recommend checking out that Eric Andre show now that you said that you're getting into Jackass stuff. And there is an episode. I said it to you. I don't know if you watched it, but it was because we were talking about Weekend at Bernie's.
Yeah.
He does a Weekend at Bernie's impression.
Yeah.
With a dead guy in front of people out the street. And I was laughing so hard. I was like, we were just talking about Bernie. We got a Bernie's.
Yeah, I'll definitely have to get more into it and give it more than just a YouTube clip show view.
Please do.
I'll report back.
It's worth it. And it's on Hulu. And now Hulu, I don't know if you heard this, Hulu is getting, have you heard this? Have you heard this? Hulu is getting wrapped up into Disney Plus. So I guess now we're going to go to Disney Plus, and one of the tiles there will be Hulu. So the main Hulu app will go away.
Yeah.
Things are changing in streaming.
Yeah, don't know how that interface is going to work, but we've been talking about these two merging. No timeline on it that I know of, though, right?
If there is one, I don't remember.
Okay. Well, I've been watching something here that is going to be very true to our topic today with the 80s. History Channel has a show on called Adam Eats the 80s. Remember the show Man vs. Food? Where the guy would go out and do all the food challenges, like either eat this spicy ass blasting thing or eat these 29 plates of oysters, or he would do like all these food challenges, the things you can go to restaurants for and win free t-shirts or get your photo on the wall of the Hall of Fame or something like that.
I don't remember that. I'm not big on the food TV shows.
Okay. Well, Adam Richman is the guy that was the man in Man vs. Food, and he's kind of gotten away from that, probably for health reasons, although he hasn't said that. But I can't imagine you're eating the amounts and the volumes and items he was eating and have too long of a trajectory health-wise. His newest show, and I'm watching it on Hulu, so I don't know when this aired. A lot of the things he's wearing masks, so it was clearly filmed during the pandemic, but it's called Adam Eats the 80s, and he goes back and like iconic 80s food. Like he'll go into a Pizza Hut and they'll make him like a pizza that was only offered in the 1980s for a short period and has gone away. So he's like tasting history, but it's all very 80s focused. I was watching one this morning. He was at the very first Chuck E. Cheese, and they still have like the animatronic band up on stage. It's like one of the last few surviving fully functional animatronic bands. And they made him food that they only offered off of their 80s menu. He went to the original Cinnabon and had them make one of the original Cinnabons. So it's pretty crazy how he goes back and eats like all this historic. He had one whole episode. It was just candy and Big League Chew, candy cigarettes, candy grenades, nerds. Remember Bonkers? Like it was like taffy, but it looked like gum, but it wasn't gum. It was taffy wrapped in more taffy.
Yeah, I do.
And then like all the commercials had like old people eating it, and like the giant fruit would fall out of the ceiling and like land on them.
Sugar Babies, Chunky, Necco wafers, circus peanuts, all those 80s candies.
Yeah, well, he features like a lot. He had a whole episode on Garbage Pail Kids. So Yeah, man, there's like a lot of tie into stuff we've been talking about in this Adam Meets the 80s show. Like I say, it's on History Channel, but I've been streaming it on Hulu, and it's probably only like 8 or 9 episodes in, but it's pretty entertaining.
I'm definitely going to watch that. That's definitely right up my alley. I didn't know anything about it. Again, there's too much content, too fucking much content out there.
You know that Domino's Pizza offered a breakfast pizza in the 1980s?
No. What was it made of?
It had like a dough bottom, but it was more like a biscuit dough bottom. And then it was topped with eggs, and you can get bacon, or you can get sausage, and you can get peppers. Now, it was almost like an omelet pizza. You would order it the night before. They would deliver it the following morning with coffee and a newspaper. And the problem was, people would order it the night before. The delivery person would come, and the person would probably be in the shower getting ready for work, and like nobody would answer the door. So like the whole thing just kind of fell apart.
Wow. Clever idea. I don't know that I want a pizza for breakfast, but I like the idea of waking up and somebody's got a breakfast for me and the newspaper and a coffee and my slippers.
Your slippers. I don't think that was part of the deal, but all right. That's a promotional tie-in. If you use promo code too much CGI.
Yeah. Get a free massage from the Domino's delivery person. Get you really ready for the day.
That's a different kind of movie, Bill.
Hey, I think Will's probably ready to come on in. All right, guys. So I have this idea in my head. I want to see if you agree. The 80s to me had 3 distinct flavors. All right. Now I'm a 48-year-old born in 1975. Will, if you don't mind revealing your age.
Yeah, no. I'm 52 years old, born in 71.
It still pisses me off how good you look. You are like the best looking guy I've ever seen. I've just got to tell you.
It's a lot of hair dye and
bullshit.
Hair plugs.
Well, I guess I'm the baby of the group because I was born in 1980. I'm 43.
Oh, okay.
So you might have a little bit of a challenge remembering the early part of the 80s. But here's
what I'm realizing when I prep for shows like this. I'm a child of the 80s, but for much of the content of the 80s, infant toddlers, they're not going out and like searching their own information. So a lot of the early 80s stuff I know is stuff that my parents put in front of me. And that was stuff like the He-Man and stuff like that. So like when we do the cartoon shows, that's right in my wheelhouse. When we start doing like deeper early MTV stuff, that's stuff I know by looking back and doing research on it, but not because I was cognizant of it while it was happening. I'm much more a product of the 90s, I'm realizing, while we do these shows.
Oh, well, we'll just kick you right out of this.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, hey, guys, it was fun.
Well, I would say the same thing about me because, being born in 71, it's a similar situation with regard to the 70s. There's certain things I remember and have a flavor for, but it's mostly towards the later 70s and definitely the 80s where I went from literally being, 10 years old to being an adult was the most impactful as far as the, what was happening, events, pop culture, etc.
Yeah. And I also realized that like political stuff, that's stuff that I know very well, and I feel like I lived it because that's what you had to study, and that's what my parents had on the news all the time. So all that stuff is like, I lived it. Pop culture stuff, I feel like I lived it in retrospect.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you had the benefit of, or your parents had the benefit, or the misfortune of having CNN kicking off at the beginning of the decade, because then they could literally have the news on 24 hours a day.
Yes, the birth of the deadly news cycle.
I think cable TV really came around like mid 80s. So for me, I remember the beginning of the 80s was darker. And by darker, I don't mean just like the content, but even like the film stock. Things just didn't seem as bright as it got later. So like when I think of the early 80s, I think of people wearing brown hats and brown coats, and it's a little gritty, and it's Barney Miller, and it's, it's dramas. It's not fun yet. The early 80s that I remember wasn't very fun. It was kind of gritty. I remember watching shows on TV that were gritty and violent, and it was darker.
Mm-hmm.
But then to me, you get to about the mid 80s, right? At this point, I'm running around backyards with my friends playing Manhunt and G.I. Joe and all that fun shit. And that's when Back to the Future was out. More Star Wars came out. Like things started to get more colorful. And then to me, at the end of the 80s, now it's hair metal and crazy MTV. MTV is now completely ruling the culture, and everything is just super bright, saturated, vibrant stuff. So it's really an interesting decade where you got 3 distinct flavors. Do you think I'm on point at all?
I agree. And, part of it is, and, our show focuses on 1980s pop culture and its effect on the years that followed. But to your point, we these decades are contrivances, right? So the reality is time just continues. So the fact that it's early in the 80s, you say it's darker. Well, that's obviously a reflection of the 1970s where, pop culture was a lot grittier then. Films were grittier. A lot of stuff was reflecting of how artists and people felt about the Vietnam War, for example, and Nixon, was still bleeding into those types of things. And then what's curious to me, as you say, we move through these things get brighter. And obviously I agree with you as far as the clothing, the music. What's fascinating to me is a lot of this was in contrast to what was happening. We still had the looming Cold War. Reaganomics had, helped some people, but not everybody, and hurt some other people. You had a lot of people out of work. Where you had these films, this music that was always happy and upbeat, the clothing that was colorful, thanks to Ocean Pacific and these other brands, was in contrast to the reality. Almost like everything became escapism as the decade went on, which I was fine with because I was a kid. So, but yeah, I agree with you, Bill.
And I would agree too, Bill. I feel that culturally, or pop culturally at least, decades don't go 80 to 90. It almost goes 75 to 85, 85 to 95. It's almost like mid-decade spans rather than 10-year spans, because you think about early 90s, that's very much what we now sometimes think of as 80s culture. It's like a bleed over.
I'm thinking about examples like MASH. MASH was a dark show. And then sometime in the mid 80s, they reboot MASH. What was that called? After MASH. And now there's like a laugh track
Yeah.
and, it's a lot brighter.
Yeah.
Oh, Radar.
Yeah, you remind me that, the theme song of the show MASH obviously comes from the film MASH. And the song in the film has words. And the first words are "suicide is painless."
Right.
And now enjoy our comedy about the Korean War.
Oh, Klinger.
Oh, yeah. Was it Klinger? He was the cross-dresser. Boy, that took some current topics on pretty early.
Yeah, nobody was complaining about Klinger indoctrinating anybody, though.
That's a good point.
Yeah, he was trying to get out of the military. Yeah.
I can't remember his plot line to know why he was dressing that way.
He would do anything to get kicked out of the war.
Yeah, that's what it was. I can't remember. He would refer to it every now and then. There was a specific code in the military that if he could prove he was, I think it was, what do we say then? Crazy. If he was crazy. I know that today saying crazy is probably not a great idea, and somehow he was suggesting he was crazy by wearing women's clothes. That they would ask him to leave, but it never worked. No one bought that he was doing it in earnest. So
you don't know Klinger's backstory? He was from Toledo, Ohio. He was my dad. I'm telling you, man, my dad was the biggest MASH fan. Still is the biggest MASH fan. I know a lot of backstories about a lot of those characters more than anybody from the 80s should,
or someone born in 1980. Certainly, yeah.
Thinking of stuff like that are definitely controversial topics now. I think about this sometimes. Unless I was unaware because I was young, nobody seemed to mind Boy George back then.
Oh, there was definitely people talking about him being weird.
Really? I remember everybody being a fan.
For sure.
Nobody ever saying anything. Yeah, it's my memory.
Really? I remember people having thoughts. They weren't as loud. There was no social media to share it on to, again, get out in front of the masses. But I've heard people with thoughts.
Well, since we're talking about music, let me ask this question. What's your favorite?
Can I ask Will the question I asked you last week? If you had to explain 80s music by picking one song, what is the one quintessential song you would play that person to give them all the feels of 80s?
All the feels?
Well, the general idea of 80s.
Wow. That's, I'm going to say it's impossible. I'll try to answer your question, but it's impossible unless we pick maybe a song per, Bill's flavors.
That's a good point.
And only because, as you guys know, so much music was, a sort of iconic or indigenous to the 1980s, right? I mean, I'd love to say early on, I think of, and for me, Bill, even a little early 80s is gritty, I agree with you, but there's these sort of moments of brightness for me. But early on, I would say Devo and the Waitresses, music by those guys, which was, avant-garde certainly at the time. And for me, I can't hear I know what, boys like and not feel like I'm dropped into a place in time in the early 1980s. But that tells you nothing about 1989, and how do we leave out hip hop?
Right.
We'd almost need a song that has synths and electric guitar. Oh, wait, I think I'm narrowing it down now. And a rap. Okay. It's going to be something off of Raising Hell, I think, maybe now. I don't think it's possible. But for me, like Bill was saying, there's probably songs within each of those, groups or time periods, flavors.
Yeah. So my pick was, I had close second. I have a number one and a close second. Number one was Let's Get Physical by Olivia Newton-John.
For all of the 80s?
Well, this is the problem because Bill picked Thriller.
Okay.
Which was like a very good example of maybe the music video wise, music wise, has the guitar lick in there, has the beat, has the dance, then also the horror element that the 80s became big for.
And it has the rapping, if you remember. Vincent Price was rapping. Yep.
I don't know if I call that rapping as much as voiceover, but yeah, however you want to define it. But that got us talking about how, much to your point, Will, there are so many different little niches and cliques of music that's happening on top of each other and adjacent to each other, and the hip hop scene and the hair metal scenes in there, and Prince is doing his thing. There's so many like huge artists. Van Halen came out towards the end of the decade. I feel like there were so many more options in the 80s than what anything we have today, and probably anything we've had since.
Yeah, and I would agree. And look, I'm somewhat biased, but quite honestly, I believe this is true. So much of what we have today, you could point, you could follow a lineage that leads back to something that was born out of the 1980s. I mean, obviously something like hip hop is, we could put squarely in the 1980s, but other things that changed in such a way, the introduction of synths, for example, it became ubiquitous throughout the 1980s. Of course, these things started a little bit earlier in other decades, but stuff changed in the 1980s that made it more popular, more easy, more, to use. That, again, I think follows to all this music you're saying. We have less diversity now, but whatever diversity we have, I think, is thanks to what happened in the 1980s.
Yeah, for sure. You did a great show on interpolation and sampling and things like that very much shows how much of today's music is influenced by things in the past, and not just the 80s, but some of that stuff went back to the 60s and 70s as well.
Yeah, that's in particular fascinating to me. And that, Luxury, who's made sort of a name for himself on social media, examining these things, does a better job than we do. But yeah, so many connections, everything's derivative. And a lot of it, again, ties back to what I love from the 1980s.
Let me just keep going with the questions. I'm loving this. All right, here's one. How did major political events in the 1980s, such as the end of the Cold War and Reaganomics, which you spoke about earlier?
Suddenly it's the McLaughlin group on here.
Crossfire.
There was Sunday morning roundtable.
We got to argue now. We can't agree.
So I mentioned earlier in this show that I've been watching Adam Eats the 80s with Adam Richman. He goes around and he eats all these foods from the 80s.
Yeah, we talked to him on the show when it first aired. Yeah.
Really? Okay. I just discovered the show on Hulu this past weekend. On the show, he was talking about how Reagan signed a bill that changed how companies could market directly to children. And the impact that this had on everything we know from the 80s, growing up in the 80s as kids, it's so clear. So he had a number on there where in the 1960s, annual money spent on children's things was like $50 million, and it ballooned by 1984 to $500 million, I think, were the numbers. So the fact that these companies can now direct it, now we have the gross out candies, now we have all these cartoons, and all the cereals are tied back to cartoons, and going back to how everything is synergized to going back to these cartoons, and it's just used to move products and toys. That's how my life was probably impacted the most by political changes and policy changes.
And it's interesting because as a kid, as you pointed out, growing up in the 1980s, to you, your perception, your experience, I would imagine, would be it's to your benefit. It means I get to watch a half-hour cartoon that's essentially advertising the toy that I have in my hand right now, or in the commercial breaks during this show advertise more toys I want to buy. And it's just this, 30 minutes or 30 minutes if you include the commercials of excitement, I guess, and to what you were saying earlier, Scott, about being a kid growing up and then maybe having to reflect back on, that colors your experience, because being a little bit older during the 1980s, I think for me, thinking about the Cold War and the effect, probably some of the immediate effects was the low-level fear I had of being annihilated by nuclear weapons at any moment, which lasted probably until the Berlin Wall came down. But our pop culture reflected that. The day after scared the shit out of me. That's still I still won't watch that again, even though nowadays, I don't know, we could probably get bombed again, although I think it toughened me up in a way that I'm like, fuck it, who cares? Bomb us. But during the 1980s, it was that low-level fear that, we could be at war with Russia at any moment. That was probably the biggest impact. Stuff that I only learned later, like you're talking about with changes, is, how many things Reagan changed, because he had a policy. He wanted to deregulate everything, which is, consistent with the conservative policies generally. And as a result, again, straight out of the 1980s, still ramifications today. So you're right. The thing about advertising to kids. He also deregulated. They been a change where TV shows no longer had to have equal time. So Fox News could be entirely conservative, and MSNBC could be entirely show the liberal slant, and still be considered news. In the 1980s or prior to that, that wasn't the case. And that's obviously had long-lasting impacts.
I was going to say, talk about things that are impacting our lives today.
Exactly, 1980s now. But and the other thing we just talked about recently, which I hadn't thought about until we talked about it on our show, was that they made changes that allowed for more companies to buy up more radio stations. So at the beginning of the 1980s, you had 50 big companies that owned, all media. Today you have 6. So back in the 1980s, it seemed to me that as a result of the way the law was then, you had more diversity in radio stations. You had radio stations playing more, introducing more new music. You never necessarily knew what you were going to hear. They're breaking new bands. Now, when you've got 6 companies owning everything, they control the playlists. They can legally, back then we call it payola. Now they can take money. Hey, play my song. All right, cool. This is a revenue stream now. It's very different. But
yeah,
I guess I'm not answering your question entirely directly, except for being scared of nuclear war, Bill. I guess to my point, because I'm doing my point now. Some of the changes we didn't appreciate then, that now, it's like, holy shit, I don't like that. I wish we had news that was balanced. I wish we had more diversity in music,
And it's funny you say that, because I was just going to say the show you did on radio and the subsequent episode with Larry the Duck Dunn and what he did for music at that time. I grew up now in early 90s through the 2000s. All I knew was Clear Channel Broadcasting and iHeartRadio, and they might be the same thing. And Nassau Broadcasting, like they're all we were talking earlier in the show, like Bill said, who listens to radio anymore? And how weird it was when they stopped putting CD players in cars. And it won't be too long before they take AM, FM radios out of cars. And I said, well, I still listen to the radio to listen to the Phillies baseball games when I'm driving. And he was like, well, can't you just stream that? And I was like, probably, but the radio is just what I know.
Yeah.
But yeah, both those channels owned by like Clear Channel, and what they push. And that's all. If that's all you had, that's all you would know is what they're pushing.
And shockingly, 88% of people still listen to the radio, and 50% of Gen Z people listen to the radio. So they still rely on it, and still, I don't know. I'm sorry, Bill. I feel like I'm taking us far afield from that.
Listen, I have nothing to add. You guys nailed everything I was going to say. And the whole idea about the media, there's a guy named Ben Bagdickian who I used to study who said, like, we're going to be...
Bagdickian? We're supposed to believe there's a guy named Bagdickie?
If his name was Bagdickie, that would be a lot easier to remember. You should have changed it. See, I didn't get to him in time. His name is Ben Bagdickian.
Oh, Bagdickian. That's better.
Yeah.
It doesn't make it much better.
But he called it. He was like, he wrote a book. It's called The Media Monopoly. And he got it 100% right. It's exactly what you said, Will.
Yeah.
Like, that's a problem. That's a problem when your voice is so centralized by business interests, when you're supposed to be the news.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's bad. But the other thing was that Cold War thing. Yeah, I was always in fear of being invaded. Red Dawn, to me, was like possible because that's what Hollywood told us was possible.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I remember our friend group, we were young teenagers, talking, all right, we got to be ready. If this shit happens to us, all right, who's doing that? Who's doing this thing? Where are we going to go? Because I lived in a big city in New Jersey. Where are we going to go? They were out in the wilderness or something.
Yeah.
And it was really a time for that. America's the best America. Like, we're the world's bodyguard. Like, we were so cocky as Americans that like everything that came out was all, America is the greatest fucking country in the world. It was so patriotic back then.
I was born in the USA, Bill. Going right back to the iconography of Bruce Springsteen and the problems I have with that.
Right. Such a patriotic song.
Yeah, right?
He loves America.
Think about how on the nose Rocky IV really was.
Well, yeah. I think that an argument can be made that Rocky IV played a role in bringing down the Berlin Wall. and then ending the Cold War. You know, it's just kind of a psyop almost, this movie, because he creates this fictional story where the great America goes to the, you know, scary Russians, and the Russians by the end are like, yes, America is the, you know, all powerful country that it claims to be. We agree.
Well, if I can change and you can change,
yes,
everybody can change.
Thank you. Right. Yeah. Tear down that wall.
How about the fashion in the 80s? You talked a little about OP, Ocean Pacific. You had to have your jams. That I remember.
Oh, yeah. My mom used to make me my jams. We used to go to the fabric store. And I got to pick out the crazy color fabric, and she would go home and sew me up some shorts.
Oh,
yeah.
That's skill.
Oh, she's quite the seamstress.
Okay. Yeah. I was going to say, I think my mom might have patched a hole in a sock once, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, I had a bunch of shirts with no buttons, so I know I didn't have Scott's mom.
Right. It's the style to wear it open.
That's right. It was grunge. By the time that came around, you could just wear a band T-shirt under it. Nobody knew. A lot of neon colors in my wardrobe, probably thanks to Ocean Pacific. And of course, the jams.
Mm-hmm.
How about Reeboks? They were big.
Oh.
You know, especially for women, I feel like those Reebok Princess with the 2 Velcro stripes up top, like the strips at the top at the ankle. I feel like every woman I know, like my mom and all of her friends, my aunt, they all wore these Reebok Princess sneakers.
I had the black version of those, the high top blacks with the two straps. Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because you say that, and I thought, well, I didn't do any trends. And now you mention these things, I'm like, well, I did that. Yeah, I had a swatch. I had, you know, I feel like I dipped in, like something, probably thanks to the change in regulation. Shit was advertised to us. I wanted to have it. My parents, if they could pull it off, you know, because they didn't always have money, we'd get us something. So I'd have like something representing it. So, yeah, I had a swatch at one point. Probably then years went by, I had Reeboks. Years went by, I had a pair of Ocean Pacific shorts.
You just defined why my mom made those shorts. We were not that well off either.
I remember, you know, when I was into, breaking on the streets, you know, like a real person from Jersey City would, I had a Latigra shirt and parachute pants and a windbreaker because you had to. It made it more, you know, the surface tension was less on linoleum.
That was logistics. That wasn't style.
Yeah. That's science.
That's science.
You really had the parachute pants.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't have them.
Oh, no. I was legit.
I had parachute pants.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
How about the Michael Jackson jacket?
That missed me, man.
No, I didn't have that. No. I don't think I've ever worn anything that was in a music video. I don't know. Maybe.
A lot of things that I feel pop stars did in the 80s, like Cyndi Lauper with dyeing the hair, and you mentioned Boy George. I feel like a lot of that stuff really didn't catch on into mainstream until grunge took over, and then there was like the goth kids would dye their hair a lot. That wasn't something that was happening in my school at the time of, but again, I was probably in 5th grade, so what do I know?
Right.
I was never a fashionable kid, so literally what you see now is still what you got back then. But the only thing I really ever got into was a calculator watch.
Oh, yeah.
A Casio calculator watch. And I remember collecting Michael Jackson and Pac-Man pins to wear on my shirt never. But I would buy these things because I knew one day I was going to wear them proudly, and they sat in a fucking drawer. Pack Fever and Beat It pins.
The day never came?
The day never came where I was brave enough to walk around with Pack Fever pins.
Your pin story brings me back, though. I had a denim jacket that had a lot of Ninja Turtle pins on it. And like the bigger the pin, the cooler the pin was. I had one that was probably 6 inches in diameter. That went dead center.
You closed your jacket with it? You pinned it through one side and out the other?
It was on the back.
Oh, okay, yeah. It looked like one of Tron's discs. You could take it off at some point.
Yes, exactly.
I don't think I owned a single pin. Huh.
Yeah, I was very shy. I was low key. I didn't want the attention, but I wanted to own it. Yeah. Pac-Man Fever. There was songs. There was Pac-Man was massive for a couple of years.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think people forget that, how big that fucking was. Scott has no idea because you were 2. But it was like...
No. I had the original Atari 2600. That was the very first video game system. My parents had that probably before I was even born. In fact, I had the one that was made by Sears Company, Sears and Roebuck.
Mm-hmm.
So they had their own version of the Atari. So I remember playing Pac-Man as early as 3 or 4.
So you're saying your experience playing Pac-Man was playing the one that was on the 2600? Then?
It was not. I played the other one. People know it now as Chuck E. Cheese, but back around here in the day, it was Showbiz Pizza with Billy Bob.
Yep.
And they had the whole animatronic band. That screams 80s. And then that became Major Magic. But when I went to Showbiz, I had my 8th birthday at Showbiz. They still had the Pac-Man video game arcade. Oh, and also Pizza Hut. How come for Pizza Hut with the tabletop Pac-Man games where you could sit at the table and look down on the screen rather than look straight ahead? It wasn't like a stand-up arcade. It was like a tabletop. I remember playing Pac-Man at Pizza Hut as well in the 80s.
I remember that. You had to get around all the pizza stains and not get eaten by the ghost trying to dodge them.
Showbiz Pizza was actually founded by Nolan Bushnell, who was also the co-founder of Atari, to create a place where kids could play arcade games. So he was trying to create a venue for his product.
Well, this is perfect segue to the next question. It says, how did you first react to the introduction of personal computers or video games in the 80s?
I got a rash. She was treated with the topical ointment. I was allergic to 8-bit. Look, again, when I was born, when I was young, we were broke. We were broke. But somehow, and my mom was working 2 jobs. We were on, welfare at some point. My dad was just out of Vietnam, was going to his college on the GI Bill and, would work whenever he could. But somehow, my dad loved electronics so much, he would put some money aside to buy a new system or stereo or something. So we had the Odyssey was our first system. It was where you had to put a plastic film over the screen to change the video game. Otherwise, it looked like Pong. Everything looked like Pong, unless you put the plastic film over your TV set. Then that would add some color, and you'd see the white blocks lit up behind the color areas, And if you had it lined up the right way, then, you could be going through a maze that was represented on the plastic screen or whatever. But so my family fully embraced it. And then from that point on, as for the most part, different systems came out. Probably when we got the Atari 2600 next in the late 70s, we had that one for years. I don't know that. We then moved into personal computers as, sort of the A's went on instead. And then I'd be playing games on there instead. But I would say my family, again, thanks to my dad and his love of electronics, which I think he had himself since he was a kid, and fully embraced, video games and computing in the 1980s.
Much like you, it sounds like with the Odyssey, all of my early computing things was always home video game consoles. I don't think we got a home computer until I was in 10th grade.
Mm-hmm.
And up to that point, when I took keyboarding in high school, it was on a typewriter. And then midway through that year, they switched over to personal computers. It wasn't a very wealthy school district either. So the change was probably late. But once I got that and I learned MS-DOS and I learned some simple root commands and stuff like that, I was really off to the races. First computer didn't even have a sound card. I installed the sound card on it. Then we got the CD-ROM. So it was certainly growing at an exponential rate from there. But I was probably late in the game. I never had a Mac or anything like that, back in the early days.
My first experience was with the Atari. Just showed up in the house one day. And a couple games and a couple different joysticks. I remember one was a wheel type of knob type of thing, so you could race the cars left and right if you wanted to.
A wheel type of knob, Bill?
It's the paddle controller.
You're being schooled by this youngin', Bill.
Yeah, the paddle controller. I don't remember being called that.
I have one right off the camera, right over there.
Wheel. I had a name this whole time. I had no idea. But I remember some friends had the ColecoVision,
right?
Yeah,
or the Intellivision. And I was like, what are those mystic monsters? I've never seen any, because they were just a little bit better than the Atari. But to me, they were way better.
Yeah.
So I would always try to go over to see what they were playing.
I agree. Yeah.
And then not long after that, the Commodore 64, I had a neighbor who was like, I'm playing my games on this computer. And that changed everything for me. He was just copying these games onto a floppy disk. I remember you could cut the floppy disk a certain way with scissors. And it was the same thing you could do with VCR tapes to allow them to not be copied over, or to copy over them. You would go and take the
break the tab
tape
out.
And but if you had to replace the tab, same thing with these discs, you could tape over the little notch. It was the same gimmick. And we would basically just copy games from each other. It was the first time it was the first thing I ever traded. I would go to a friend's house and go, I got Wild West, Aliens, and Crystal Castles. What do you got? I got Q*bert. I got, and we would swap games on the Commodore. I thought the Commodore 64 had some incredible games too.
The first game I ever remember swapping on a computer was Wolfenstein 3D. And it was 3.5 hard disks. 3.5-inch floppies. And that one copy of Wolfenstein was probably pirated around Reading, Pennsylvania 100 times over.
Yeah, that's the only time in the early 80s, mid 80s, that's the only time I remember really actively participating in what essentially was piracy.
Right.
It'd be something I probably would later frown on, or if I understood what was going on then as a kid, maybe I would have felt a little bad about it. But you're right. In high school, people were just trading discs, and you'd kick it home and see what games you had on there, and it was exciting.
Yeah.
There was never a moment where I thought I was stealing somebody's hard work. Like, you're totally right.
Exactly.
I thought they were all free games that people were making for me.
Yeah.
How about this question? Can you recall a significant event from the 80s that has had a lasting impact on your personal life? That's a good question.
I'm going to say the birth of Scott. It's got to be.
You know what? I'm going to say the birth of Scott, too.
Yeah, that probably had a big impact on you, Scott. As well as me. All right, next question.
Event? No, that's tough. I think probably if you talk about sort of the technological, maybe if you think of that as maybe something that happened in the 80s that had the longest lasting effect, really born out of the 70s, 60s, it goes back decades, but the fact that synthesizers became more available because and then became more cost effective as time went on because I was always into writing music, still am to this day, and probably the thing that I've never stopped doing was writing music, and in part was again because of how eventually cheap. And I think our first keyboard had one of those little Casio, the white and black one that was like do 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 do. We got it at a flea market for like $50. It was probably geez, that sounds outrageous now to think about it. We overpaid, but the fact that again it became more easy to get your hands on one because prior to that in the 70s, and even in the early 80s, to get these keyboards that the musicians used in much of the music that was popular then, $14,000, $20,000, but to this day I have a keyboard or I use emulators on my computer that to emulate those sounds. For me, the single most technological advance, I'm changing your question slightly because I don't have an answer except for Scott at the big reading, would be the thing that's had the longest lasting impact on me, I think.
The Casio you got at the yard sale, was that like one of those octave and a half keyboards?
If even. It wasn't even had keys. It was buttons.
Oh, okay.
So the keys didn't go down. You could see it. I think it actually became a thing where it was used in some songs since in the 90s and 2000s where there's some tracks where they would, some of the songs, it's so simple sounding.
Some of the best sounds. It really is. We talk about synthwave sometimes and, there's a whole tons of bands still doing synthwave. They're playing with those old Casio sounds and those 808 beats. And they're making great music with that. Those sound effects were great.
Mm-hmm.
And I like that you twisted that question a little because now I have two answers. So technological changes. Yeah, it just really music started to change, but video started to change too because they were less reliant on film, I think, and more reliant on videotape. And once they started to get into videotape and started to see all the things they could do and MTV videos coming out, and suddenly we were seeing things in MTV videos that you never saw in a movie before. And then, Scott and I were commenting not too long ago when we were talking about different movie directors, how many of them started out in the video world in the 80s. So a lot of what they were learning on MTV, and MTV is my second answer for a big event. I mean, MTV changed everything. By the time I was tuned in completely in 1988, the only thing I ever had on at any time was MTV. So I was basically a fish in their barrel. Those are huge deals. And to think that MTV isn't even around anymore, that's amazing to me. To think that nobody uses videotape anymore, everything is digital, and we have so much more technology to help us create even these podcasts with such ease is so amazing to me. And I think people just don't really remember how different it is. You get used to living this way. You don't get you never go back and celebrate how simple things were and how it forced your imagination to try to do different things. The name of the show is Too Much CGI, based on the fact that I think we show everything and we don't allow any imagination left in some of our stories and film. And I think that's one of the things I really liked about the 80s. Forced us to use our imagination.
Your answer of MTV makes me laugh because thinking back when I was like 8, 9, really getting into my own music style, finding out who I was musically, I would put on MTV and I would hear my mom yelling down, "You're not watching music on television, are you? That's what the radio's for." And it was like very much something you would see in an MTV music video with like parents just don't understand or some shit going on like that. But yeah, I would get in trouble for watching MTV. And like, no, all I want to watch is Ragdoll. It's 1988. I want to see Aerosmith on television. What are you talking about? And yeah, she would have a big problem with music on television. My answer, though, it probably didn't have as big of an impact at its time as what it does now, but the invention of the cell phone has grown much more from what it was back in the 80s.
Oh, yeah. It was a giant brick back then.
Oh, yeah.
Like, literally like a cinder block. Or it was in your car. There's a scene in Lethal Weapon where where he's calling back, Murtaugh's calling back to tell him, Riggs is nuts and he doesn't want anything to do. They're on a bridge and he has a giant block. It looks like a military thing. It's a giant block with a handle and dials and he takes the phone off of it and he's on it. That's a cell phone.
Yeah.
As far as I know, I don't know what they call it, probably a satellite phone.
They always showed in early like cell phone videos, and even looking back on it now, it's always like this yuppie day trader, like on like this giant handheld thing, and he's like, yeah, fantastic.
Yep, he's always sitting in a convertible.
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
So Bill, since you mentioned CGI in the name of the show, I got to tell you, I started listening to your show because I was like, I want to hear about too much CGI because that's something I bitch about. My wife is constantly, all right, that's enough already. But I haven't heard about any CGI in any episode, which reminds me that once again, it's time to play.
You gotta be kidding.
All right, so on my show, we often surprise our co-hosts with a game. So since you guys don't talk about CGI, and since that ChatGPT quiz on the last episode was such a disaster,
what?
I would agree.
What?
I've got some trivia questions for you here about CGI in the 1980s. And you guys can give your separate answers or you can team up if you want. So I've got 5 questions, all related to CGI as it was used in films in the 1980s.
All right.
This is amazing.
Are you ready? Okay, here we go. First question. Again, you can both answer or you can team up, whatever. One of the earliest films to use CGI, this 1982 movie filmed much of the live action in black and white.
I was going to say Star Trek right off the bat.
Okay.
I think of them because the motion picture came out in the 70s. That's right. Wrath of Khan was the first one in the 80s.
The first thing that came to my mind was Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Also a 70s film.
Oh, was it? Okay.
I'm giving you a break, Scott, since you were born in 80.
Thank you. Appreciate the consideration.
Best I can come up with is Garbage Pail Kids.
That was 88.
No, it's not Garbage Pail Kids. It's Tron.
Tron. That makes sense. It makes a lot of sense.
So early CGI film, they filmed what would be in the virtual world. They filmed the actors in black and white and later colorized it to make it seem as if it was, digital.
That works. So that's how they got that really rich contrast throughout the entire movie.
Exactly.
Tron was the odyssey of the movie world.
Yeah, with the little little plastic. In the audience, everyone in the theater, put plastic over your face now. This is going to look fantastic. Tron is kind of like an inverse Wizard of Oz because the real world is full color, but they shot the fake world, the fantasy world in black and white. All right, question number 2. This 1985 film features the first all CGI character, a stained glass knight, who only appears on screen for about 15 seconds.
It's young Einstein. No, young Sherlock Holmes.
That's right.
Young Einstein was something with Yahoo Serious. Young Sherlock Holmes.
It was not young Einstein. I can see.
Yeah.
Wasn't Steven Spielberg involved in that? I think that was like a produced by Steven Spielberg movie.
Yeah, I think that was an Amblin film, right? Yeah, I believe you're right there.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go. Now, question number 3. Released in 1984. So now center yourself on 1984. The best year for movies, by the way. This film, was the first to use CGI effects to represent real-world objects, including spaceships. 1984. Spaceships. A lot of spaceships. Space battles. Entirely CGI space battles.
Ugh. I mean, it's not Return of the Jedi. Oh, Last Starfighter.
That's right!
Are you Googling answers right now?
No. Go back and watch The Last Starfighter now. As great a movie as it is, you're going to go, how the fuck did I think that these special effects were special?
I know. I wish they would just redo that part since it's all the space battles are 100% CG. Like they're not really editing folks in compositing live action. They could just replace it all and update the movie in that way.
That'd be fun. Why not? Well, see, now I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth because I also say, you shouldn't touch up these things. But sometimes I'm like, you know what? At this point, if you got the technology to make the story better, maybe I'm coming around to it. So if you can make the special effects better, keep the story tight, the special effects now take you out of the story. They just do. They're dated. Maybe I don't mind you touching up the special effects.
I wouldn't want you sticking Jabba the Hutt where he doesn't belong.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you're making me feel special edition prequel movies here, Bill. I don't like that.
I think if you just update literally shot for shot, just improve the quality, don't change any of the angles.
Yeah.
It would still maintain that sort of vintage feel, but with more believable spaceships.
I would like doing this more than all these remakes that they're doing now. They're just like recasting, redoing the entire movie, basically the exact same story, but
right.
Yeah, why not just keep it original and then punch it up a bit?
Here's your next question. Current day memes use images from this 1985 MTV award-winning music video to prove we couldn't have faked the moon landing. So there's memes now. It's like, people, we faked the moon landing, 1985, and they show this picture.
And it's from a video?
It's from an award-winning music video. It was very groundbreaking. Again, the category is CGI. CGI.
Moon landing. Award-winning video.
Being forbidden to watch MTV, I feel like I'm at a disadvantage.
Yeah.
But I do know that the Moon Man award that they give comes from this video.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't know what the video is.
No, you guys are off on this one. I'm looking for Money for Nothing.
Money for Nothing.
The one the MTV Video Music Award in 1985 was 100. It was too much CGI.
It was.
In fact.
It was also parodied by Weird Al for being too much CGI.
Exactly, right. All right, final question here. Released in 1989, the then cutting-edge water effects used in this film were later tweaked for use as the liquid metal of the T-1000 in Terminator 2. So ILM first broke this technology creating water effects in this 1989 movie and then just modified it, a couple years later for Terminator 2.
I think it's the Abyss.
I was going to guess
right!
the Abyss, yeah.
You got it.
All right, Bill.
That was awesome.
You were 2 out of 5 and I was 0 out of 5. To be fair, the title Too Much CGI was a working title and we just went with it.
Oh.
Bill often talks about building the ship as we're sailing, and that's kind of where we're at.
In the middle of the ocean?
Yes.
Doggy paddling?
Well, we got a raft at this point.
Yeah, okay, good.
Jaws just came by and fucking shattered us, and now we're just floating on a plank of wood.
That says too much CGI on it.
That was awesome. Will. I just wanted to go back to you with 2 more questions, just for you.
Yeah.
Who was the best person you interviewed and why?
Jeez. Well, to say best is probably going to be tricky because I've had the great fortune of speaking to folks that are great guests. I guess my fear is always that you got to drag answers out of folks and get them to tell cool stories. But everybody I've spoken to has been fantastic. But I will say this: my favorite interview is Cassandra Peterson, who we better know as known as Elvira. And the reason why is, and my wife says don't tell this to people because it's creepy, is because I really feel like reading her book before I interviewed her, because it was to promote her book that had just come out, Yours Cruelly. I fell in love with her. She has an amazing story, and it's not one that you would suspect. Her early childhood was filled with a lot of challenges from the youngest age, possible. Where she had this tragedy where she was, severely burned with hot water from a stove that affected her throughout the rest of her life, really, mentally and such. But so falling in love with these, and she had these crazy sort of adventures. I nearly say sexcapades, but she's very prudish for throughout her teen years, although she's getting into these situations it's like, please let her survive this with rock stars that and that sort of thing. But so when I finally got to talk to her, I just felt like, oh, I love this woman. So that was my favorite interview. And also she's just so forthcoming and fantastic and charming and beautiful. But again, to say who's the best, they've all been fantastic.
I heard that one, and you have a really good style when you interview. Like, it's very conversational, and they open up to you. And I think that's great.
It mostly works when I'm attracted to them.
Hey, Will, it's about that time. You want to stay for the news?
Yeah, if you have me and you want me to stick around, yeah, sure.
I'll leave you
If you want to
beg.
kick me out, that's fine too.
Nah, we'd like you here. It's a slow news week, so it's not going to take too long. But here's something sent over from Scott. Scott, you sent something from ScreenRant.com. According to a report by Screen Rant, Marvel reportedly changed its plans for Phase 5 and 6 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe after witnessing Jonathan Majors' performance in Disney Plus's Loki show and the upcoming Ant-Man film, Ant-Man and the Wasp, which isn't upcoming. I just saw it the other day. Majors played the character He Who Remains in Loki and portrays the main villain Kang the Conqueror in Ant-Man the Wasp, Quantumania. His acting received high praise, leading Marvel to make Kang the center of the multiverse saga. However,
how old is this article? Because I got a twist for you. You didn't see coming.
Here comes the twist. However, Major's recent arrest on assault charges has created uncertainty about Marvel's future plans. The original Phase 5 and 6 plans for the MCU remains undisclosed, but the introduction of Kang suggests that other characters like the Beyonder or Doctor Doom may have had a role. Depending on Marvel's decision regarding Majors, the direction of the MCU could change significantly in the coming months. And that makes sense. They're making these movies up on the fly. They change things without any real thought. They wake up and go, hey, we need to put this into this movie that's now filming. Quick, get an email over to that director and work this in. That's a crazy way to make movies when you got a guy like this who's completely sabotaging you and you're trying to build the next, big things around him. They must be shitting their pants over there in MCU.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about it last week as far as not knowing what's happening with this trial and these assault charges and things, but they really did build their future on this guy, and now they're going to have to do a hard pivot if they go the way of kind of phasing him out.
I was going to say, and now I realize how horrible this sounds, even worse than the assault charges.
That's never a great way to say.
Anything that follows is going to be not good. So I don't really mean this, but even worse than the assault charges was Quantumania. That movie was terrible. Now, of course, I don't really mean that, but I think, to the fact that they have to sort of, now quickly change things to be able to accommodate the fact that this guy is a horrible person, allegedly, by more than one woman now. I think there's 3 women that have come forth at least, is the fact that Quantumania was a terrible film.
Yeah.
And it underutilized that character, and it was really unnecessary. I mean, literally the way it starts and ends had no impact on anything without giving spoilers. But, they were supposed to be stopping this one thing from happening or not happening. It doesn't even matter whether it did or not. So I think Marvel's got a bigger problem than Jonathan Majors. Is something happened between, the first 10, years or so and lately, where it seemed so like, Kevin Feige was hailed as this god because he sort of had this map and this vision where he can connect all these films, and it was working. Yeah, the off sequel like Iron Man 3 or so that was like, it's fine. But otherwise, stuff really worked. And in the last few films, it's just like Bill's saying, they're winging it.
Yep.
Feels like they're winging it.
Bill, I think you said the ending of the Ant-Man movie, the newest one, Quantumania, was just an item of convenience and just lazy storytelling and no good. Also, too much CGI.
Yeah. And spoilers for anyone, turn the thing off now because I'm about to fuck up the ending.
Danger, Will Robinson. Danger. No, Will Robinson. Danger.
My wife loved the ending, and I was just so confused by it. So at the end of this thing, there's a giant army, right? We got to fight this giant army, but there's only 4 ant people. What do we do? And I'm like, God, just don't find ants in this world. They did something worse. They found ants from when they all got sucked in. It turns out they sucked in the ants that were also from the outside.
Yeah.
And Hank Pym, right? Michael Douglas, throughout the entire movie doesn't disclose that he was actually feeling their presence. So at the end, when we need an army, coincidentally, we have an ant army.
Yeah.
It's just like, come on, guys. This is the best you can come up with. This is a major story for you. And you phoned it in like you're phoning in everything. Why are you making everything so fucking big?
Yeah.
You're going to run out of ant army, ideas eventually. So it's time to start changing the story because this isn't working anymore. It was so bad.
I thought in the part after that, because I thought, they're taking a chance. We were teased and folks were predicting that Scott Lang would die. And it seemed like, in the very least, he was going to be stuck in that quantum universe, which seemed like a fate worse than death almost, because, what could possibly happen to him there? We may not be able to get him back. And I thought, oh, wow, this is upsetting to me, but wow, something really consequential from this film. And then not 5 seconds later, he jumps out of the portal and he's like, oh, I'm back.
Right.
Fine.
Lack of consequences is one of the things that a story we read, I think last week or maybe the week before, talked about how there's just no consequences for these people, so it's hard to care.
Yeah.
I remember people didn't really like part 2. I liked part 2. It was just a self-contained little story that didn't get any bigger than San Francisco. And that's fine. That's fine for a movie. It's okay. They don't all have to be Endgame.
Right. But if they do, spend the time to really figure out how it fits in. I was so disappointed with the combination we had of Loki and then the Spider-Man No Way Home and then the Doctor Strange sequel, because we were pitched, when Feige was one of these, D23 conventions or wherever they do these upfront type things, these movies are going to have these consequences, and just the names alone suggested this, and Quantumania, that they were interwoven, and then they were really almost like standalone films. Like what happens at the end of Spider-Man, it's kind of doesn't matter when Doctor Strange rolls around. It's like, well, I helped Peter Parker with this thing. It's like a throwaway line. And the fact that, what's happening with the multiverse in Strange doesn't seem the same as the multiverse in Spider-Man, the way it works. It's just, and then to hire Sam Raimi and not let him go full Sam Raimi, he felt like he was being held back a little bit.
Agree.
I don't know. They got problems.
Hard agree. Yeah, I think that's what we're talking about. It's like last minute changes. Can't make a really strong, well-woven story when it's all these last minute reactive changes. You listening, Kevin?
I'm hoping James Gunn is listening too. I'm a big DC guy as far as comics goes. That's the comics that I most read in my life. Marvel, I was fine. Mostly because of Superman and Batman. Grew up with those, between Christopher Reeve and Adam West, I was solidified as those were my favorite superheroes. So when it came time to read comics, that's what I gravitated towards. I really hope and I trust for the most part that James Gunn will have learned these lessons from observing the Zack Snyder universe and what Kevin Feige's been doing lately.
Yeah. Amen.
He listens. He'll make some changes.
He listens to
for
too
you.
much CGI. Is he listening though because he thinks it has anything to do with CGI? Because he's not going to listen past the first 5 minutes after that.
He's listening because he knows we're fans and he likes the ego boost. Did you guys see the trailer for the new Mortal Kombat game?
I did.
Mortal Kombat 1. They're rebooting.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes.
And it is hyper gory. It is
yes, it is.
The animation, whatever they figured out in this game, they just 10x'd the graphics and it looks absolutely amazing. And one of the things that they're known for is having secret characters. So the secret characters for the first, I guess they call it a DL pack, downloadable, whatever it is.
Right.
The first secret characters are
Jean-Claude Van Damme.
Jean-Claude Van Damme. You can now be Jean-Claude Van Damme in Mortal Kombat. For some reason, you can be. So Jean-Claude Van Damme was the Johnny Cage character. They wanted him to actually be the character. They based it on him, and they could just never get it to work out. So now he's a downloadable skin for an existing character. He's not even a standalone character. He's just a skin. But some of the standalone characters they have are, I got to remember. One is Omni-Man. I didn't see the Invincible cartoon show on HBO.
Oh, it's really good.
I'll have to watch that.
That's also really gory.
The other is The Boys, the superhero guy, Homelander. So he's going to be a playable character too. And there may be another, I'm just not remembering.
So they're releasing this game to all the big consoles, the PlayStations, the Xboxes, 3 different versions. And like the highest one's like almost $200. It's half the cost of what the console is to play it on. You get a Liu Kang statue and you get all the playable characters and things. The base package will not get you these playable skins. You have to spend at least, I think, $90 for the mid-tier package to get the skin of Jean-Claude Van Damme and the others. But I can guarantee you, if you buy the basic one, you can pay for downloadable content later on.
You know what I like to do? I like to go to YouTube, watch somebody else play the character for free. I don't even have to pay for the skin. I just see it, and then I go, all right, now I know.
You're one of those Twitch guys.
I just watched the trailer while you guys were talking. just to see the level of gore that we're talking about here, because look, I am not of the mind that violent video games beget violent people. I am not of that. There's been too much studies that show that that's not true, including in Japan, where they have some crazy notions about art and pop
horror
culture.
movies and everything else. Yeah,
horror. Everything's like a fever dream there. Everything's got a tentacle that's going someplace it shouldn't go. But their society, relatively speaking, low crime, low violence. So that's just kind of, for the most part, proves that, that's not true. But I do have that, question, like, do we need to see this? Like, seeing this clip, it's like, do people really need to see this? And you got to imagine it has some impact. Now, it doesn't mean I'm going to go want to fatality somebody in the street. But it must have some kind of impact of desensitizing to me the notion, or affecting my level of empathy, maybe. I don't know,
Don't go knocking fatalitying people on the street. I like how we're making another verb. Fatalitying.
Finish
No,
him.
as I get older, and I loved horror movies growing up, and I loved all this stuff because it was so cartoonish to me. Yeah. But as I get older and I watch, we were talking about this on the show. I watched the remake of Texas Chainsaw Massacre and I came away disturbed. Like, I was like, this is just murder porn. This isn't that, holy shit, that's shocking, how funny. That's so, I don't know. Do we need more of this? I don't think so. Yeah. Do people really want to do these murder simulators? They must really enjoy it for some reason. I don't. I outgrew it.
Yeah. So Mortal Kombat 1 came out to much horrible acclaim, I guess, and also it was both famous and infamous at the same time. They brought out the video game rating system because of Mortal Kombat 1. It got the rating of M for mature, and then 3 years later, Mortal Kombat 2 comes out and just is like to the nth degree with every single fatality they could have done in Part 1. And looking back, Part 1's very tame, but now we went up to like Mortal Kombat 12, I think, and different iterations in between. And now we're back to Mortal Kombat 1 to reboot it. Like, you can't keep moving that needle. Like, you've maxed out, I think, probably at 2. It can't get any worse than what it's already been. The graphics can get better. It can look less cartoony, which is probably leading more to desensitization. But, yeah, I can't see fatalities being worse than what they've already been.
There was a game called Manhunt that came out by Rockstar, who makes Grand Theft Auto. And that was... what year was that? That was probably the 2000s. And that was a console game. And I remember playing that, and you have to sneak up behind people. And it's very much like the Hitman game where you have to figure out the right way to do it. But if you don't have any like real weapons to kill these people, you basically, one of the things you can do is grab a wire and, saw this guy's head off with a wire. And I remember watching this going, that's fucked up. Like, I'm not enjoying this. That's a little bit too much for me. And just thinking, maybe I'm a prude. Maybe I'm a puss. But that was my limit. I was like, I don't want shit like this.
They didn't have that on Atari 2600.
Yeah, when you stab the dragon in Adventure, it wasn't very...
His head goes backwards.
I got one more story, maybe two. How about Ray Stevenson? Have you heard about Ray Stevenson? He's finally getting his chance in Hollywood. He's been in so many things, and it just never takes off for him. Now he's in Star Wars. He's in the Ahsoka show. He gets to be a Sith.
Again, how old is this article? Because I got a twist for you that you didn't see coming.
Oh, what?
Ray Stevenson. He just died.
Oh,
what? He died? Ray Stevenson.
Yeah. Guy from The Punisher, the guy in the new Star Wars thing. Yeah, he died a week ago.
How unfortunate is that? The guy's just about to get some serious airtime. His career's even getting bigger now that he's with Marvel, and fucking dies. That sucks. And I like this guy. He played the Punisher. They tried to reboot the Punisher, and I thought he was a pretty good Punisher. He was in Thor. He played one of the little side characters. But I like him. I've seen him in things. He's cool.
Yeah.
What a bummer. Well, the only other story to talk about is The Little Mermaid, and I'm just so sick of hearing about The Little Mermaid.
Hold on, you're not going to talk about Tina Turner?
Oh, have I got a twist for you? How old's that story?
No. The death is what I was thought he was. That's what I was referring to.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Have you heard?
And on that note, that's a perfect way to end the show. All right, everybody, thank you so much for listening. Make sure you go over. You know what, Will? I'm going to let you do a little plug for your show and tell people where they can find you.
Yeah, if you'd like to, certainly check us out at 1980s Now. That's the name of the podcast. We're available on every podcast platform. Where every week we talk about another aspect of 1980s pop culture, but bigger than just reminiscing about it from a nostalgic point of view. We try to connect it to what's happened since as a result, including leading up to today.
It's a great show. It's a high quality show. It's a show that's going to be around for a while, so definitely subscribe to it.
One of my favorites, if you're going to check it out, start with Cocaine Bear. The true crime Cocaine Bear was a fantastic episode.
Oh, thank you. That's such a blast doing those.
Scott, do you have any final thoughts?
I have a question for Will, and this goes back to something that was shared on his show when they were talking about radio DJs. Will's co-host, John, had mentioned that growing up, you never really know who your radio DJs were. You knew their voice, you never saw their face, and then occasionally they would host the Independence Day Parade or the Memorial Day Parade, and they show up and you're like, who's this geezer? Right. And then the side of the car, the convertible has their name on. You're like, oh, holy shit, that's reality meeting fantasy, and I didn't have that. And this got me thinking, in my head, and I'm not a social media guy. I know you guys are all over social media and things, but in my head, I have a picture of what John looks like, and I want to ask you a question, and you can tell me if I'm on the right path or if I'm way off. In my head,
John's gonna love this.
In my head, John is George from One Crazy Summer.
Oh no! Please, you're not
Joel Murray.
Joel Murray, yeah. Huh. I wouldn't say John looks like Joel Murray necessarily, but I get that.
Okay.
And I will say, out of all of the cast of One Crazy Summer, and you could throw Bobcat Goldthwait in there. That's the character he's most similar to. Yeah,
okay.
As far as
all right, I think it's his on-air personality. Very much would match with that character. And I was just wondering if the visual went the same way. So that was my most. When I heard you were coming on the show, I was like, oh, I got to ask him this.
You could just Google it. But you know what? I think this, to the extent, the point about seeing the DJ in the parade, and you're like, oh my gosh. Because they all sound so handsome. That's part of the challenge. That's where, face for radio came from, this expression. But I think if you find John, again, he's on a YouTube channel, Gen X Grown Up is his own personal thing. I don't think you'll be disappointed. I don't think it'll be the shock that I remember getting from first seeing Scott Shannon back in the 19...
Oh, yeah, that was a shock.
I remember Wayne's World had a great clip where they were meeting Handsome Dan, and Handsome Dan looked like George Carlin.
Yeah, you're right.
Who's the guy that did Disco Duck? He was an eyesore. Can we all agree that there's only one good-looking DJ, and that is Shadow Stevens?
Oh yeah, there you go.
Mm-hmm. All right,
handsome fellow.
Let's go out with some agreement.
Right.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for listening to Too Much CGI. Make sure you go and check out Will and the gang over at 80s Now. We will be back next week. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thank you. See you next time.
Thanks, guys.
Okay.